On the night of the 16th of September, 1935, inside Harlem's most glamorous and dangerous nightclub, a single act of public humiliation quietly rewrote the rules of power in New York's criminal underworld. The Cotton Club was packed with politicians, celebrities, bootleggers, and men who decided life and death with a nod. Jazz filled the air, illegal liquor flowed freely, and among the crowd sat Bumpy Johnson, calm, silent, watching everything. Across the room, Dutch Schultz believed he owned Harlem already. He had the money, he had the guns, and most of all, he believed he had something even more powerful: racial dominance that allowed him to say anything to anyone without consequences. That belief led him to do something no gangster had ever dared to do so openly before: publicly insult and racially humiliate Harlem's most dangerous man in front of hundreds of witnesses. Schultz thought it was a display of power. He thought it was the end of resistance. What he didn't realize was that, in that moment, he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He had turned business into something personal. He had turned territory into honor. And he had unknowingly started a countdown. Within hours, bodies would begin to appear. Not randomly, not chaotically, but with precision, one per day, each death carrying a message that would echo through the underworld for generations. 7 days, 8 men, and a lesson written in blood about respect, race, and consequences. This is the true story of how one insult inside the Cotton Club led to one of the most calculated retaliations in American criminal history. Harlem, New York. Monday night, the 16th of September, 1935. The Cotton Club was overflowing, more than 200 patrons packed tightly around candlelit tables as the band played, and illegal whiskey flowed without pause. Politicians sat beside celebrities, mobsters beside wealthy downtown elites, all pretending this was just another glamorous night out. Near the back of the room, Bumpy Johnson sat alone, nursing a drink, watching the room with the quiet intensity that defined him. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to observe. Across the club, Dutch Schultz was anything but subtle. Fueled by expensive liquor and months of frustration, Schultz suddenly stood up from his reserved table near the stage. His face was flushed, his movements unsteady but deliberate. Without lowering his voice or attempting discretion, he began stomping across the club toward Johnson. Conversations died mid-sentence. The band faltered. Everyone sensed something dangerous was about to happen. Schultz reached Johnson's table and slammed his hand down so hard the glass jumped, spilling bourbon across the surface. Then he shouted, not just loudly, but loudly enough that the entire Cotton Club heard every word. He didn't negotiate. He didn't threaten quietly. He publicly questioned Johnson's legitimacy, mocked his operations in Harlem, and used language so openly racist that even in 1935, inside a whites-only nightclub, the room froze in shock. This wasn't business talk. This was humiliation. Johnson didn't move. He didn't reach for the gun he carried. He didn't raise his voice or show anger. He simply looked up at Schultz, his expression empty of emotion, and waited. That silence, absolute and heavy, was what terrified witnesses most. It felt less like submission and more like judgment. When Johnson finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, almost detached. He gave Schultz 7 days to remove every one of his men from Harlem. After that, any white operator found running policy in the neighborhood would die, not arrested, not beaten, dead. There was no shouting, no drama, just certainty. Schultz laughed. A loud, confident laugh meant to reassure himself and entertain the room. He turned to the crowd, mocking the idea that a black gangster could give him an ultimatum. Then he turned back to Johnson and made his own promise: submit or be destroyed. Johnson didn't reply. He finished his drink, stood up slowly, and walked out of the Cotton Club without looking back. Schultz believed he had won. He believed he had publicly crushed the last resistance in Harlem. He went home that night convinced the conflict was over. 6 hours and 43 minutes later, the first body was found. Dutch Schultz went to sleep that night believing he had settled everything. In his mind, the confrontation at the Cotton Club had been decisive, a public display meant to break the last serious resistance in Harlem. By humiliating Bumpy Johnson in front of hundreds of witnesses, Schultz assumed fear would do the rest. Harlem, he believed, would fall in line. But while Schultz slept, Johnson was already moving quietly, methodically, and with absolute clarity. Johnson had not been surprised by the insult. For months, he had watched Dutch Schultz expand into Harlem, pushing out black operators with money, violence, and political protection. Others had folded. Johnson had waited. And when Schultz chose to make the conflict personal, publicly, racially, and irreversibly, Johnson understood something critical had changed. This was no longer about territory. It was about authority, respect, and setting a rule that would outlive both men. As dawn approached on Tuesday morning, Harlem was still quiet. Schultz's organization was unaware that the clock had already started. At 6:23 a.m., a sanitation worker discovered the first body behind a warehouse in West Harlem. It belonged to one of Schultz's key policy collectors, an essential piece of the machinery that kept his Harlem operation running. Attached to the body was a simple handwritten note, clear and unmistakable in its message. 1 down, 7 to go. Leave Harlem. The meaning was instantly understood. This was not a random killing. It was the opening move in a calculated campaign. Word spread rapidly through police channels, through speakeasies, and through the criminal underworld. By breakfast time, everyone who mattered knew what had happened and why. Schultz heard the news at his headquarters and initially dismissed it as coincidence. That confidence lasted only until he learned about the note. For the first time, the reality set in. Johnson had not been bluffing. The 7-day deadline was not a threat meant to intimidate. It was a schedule. Schultz ordered his men to find Johnson immediately, offering money, issuing threats, demanding information from anyone who might know where he was hiding. But Johnson had vanished. His operations were silent, his presence erased, and Harlem, still burning with anger over the public humiliation at the Cotton Club, refused to cooperate. That afternoon, another message arrived at Schultz's door. It repeated the countdown. It warned that another death would follow before the day was over. The pressure was no longer abstract. It was personal, relentless, and escalating. Schultz now faced a choice he never expected to confront: retreat from Harlem or watch his organization be dismantled piece by piece. The 7 days had begun. From the moment the first body was found, it became clear this was not chaos, it was design. Bumpy Johnson had no intention of striking Dutch Schultz directly. Killing Schultz would have been dramatic, but disastrous. It would have triggered immediate retaliation from powerful allies, unified white syndicates against Harlem, and turned a local conflict into an all-out war Johnson could not afford. Instead, Johnson chose a far more effective approach: dismantle the operation so completely that Schultz would have nothing left to fight with. Johnson understood how power actually worked in Harlem. Schultz had money and weapons, but his control depended on a small group of men who collected bets, enforced compliance, and kept cash flowing. These were not famous gangsters. They were operators, replaceable in theory, but essential in practice. Remove them in the right order, with the right message, and the entire structure would collapse without a single shot fired at the top. That night, Johnson disappeared from public view. His policy banks closed. His name vanished from the streets. To Schultz, it looked like fear, exactly what he expected after the Cotton Club confrontation. That illusion was intentional. While Schultz searched Harlem for a man who no longer existed, Johnson worked through a tight inner circle, issuing instructions with precision and discipline. No public meetings, no unnecessary communication. Absolute silence. The plan was simple and ruthless. 1 man per day, each chosen for his role in Schultz's Harlem expansion. Each death would be discovered quickly. Each would carry a message that made the pattern impossible to ignore. This was not revenge fueled by emotion. It was pressure, applied steadily, designed to break morale and force a retreat. Every operator left alive would wake up knowing the countdown was continuing and that tomorrow it could be their turn. Just as important was the audience. Johnson wasn't speaking only to Schultz. He was speaking to Harlem. By making the conflict about respect rather than profit, he transformed public opinion into a shield. Schultz could threaten, bribe, and intimidate, but he could not buy cooperation from a community that felt publicly insulted. Harlem closed ranks, and Johnson became invisible, present only through the consequences he unleashed. By the third day, Schultz's confidence was gone. Fear replaced anger. Guards were doubled. Movements became erratic. And still, the deaths continued. The message was unmistakable. This would not stop on its own. The machine was being taken apart, one piece at a time, and the man who built it could only watch. By midweek, the rhythm was unmistakable. Each morning brought another discovery, another message, another reminder that the countdown was real and unstoppable. What had begun as dismissal inside Dutch Schultz's inner circle turned into quiet panic. His Harlem operation, once expanding with confidence, was now paralyzed. Men stopped answering calls. Routes were changed at random. Safe houses were abandoned overnight. Nobody felt safe long enough to sleep. Schultz responded the only way he knew how. More pressure. He doubled security, sent crews into Harlem to demand information, and put money on the table for anyone willing to reveal where Bumpy Johnson was hiding. The result was the opposite of what he expected. Doors closed, conversations ended. Harlem did not cooperate. The memory of the Cotton Club humiliation was still fresh, and no amount of threats could erase it. Johnson had turned public opinion into armor. Each new death tightened the psychological vice. The notes were brief and consistent, marking progress like tally marks on a wall. They didn't boast, they didn't explain, they simply counted. That restraint was what terrified Schultz's men the most. There was no rage to burn out, no negotiation to be had, only a process that would continue until Harlem was abandoned. Inside Schultz's organization, trust began to fracture. Guards questioned orders. Operators begged to be reassigned or to leave the city entirely. Meetings became arguments. Every man knew the same truth. The boss could protect himself, but he couldn't protect all of them. And Johnson had made it clear this wasn't about killing leaders, it was about erasing presence. By Friday, Schultz was no longer angry. He was calculating survival. The idea of retreat, unthinkable days earlier, entered serious discussion. Each additional body made the cost of staying higher than the cost of leaving. Harlem had become hostile territory, not because of superior firepower, but because Johnson had stripped Schultz of legitimacy, cooperation, and confidence. The week was not yet over. The countdown continued, and with every passing hour, the question shifted from whether Schultz would leave Harlem to how many more men would die before he accepted defeat. By the weekend, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Dutch Schultz had lost control of Harlem not through a decisive battle, but through exhaustion, fear, and inevitability. Each new message made the same point with growing clarity. This campaign would continue as long as his men remained. There was no bargaining window, no compromise clause, no way to intimidate it into stopping. The structure Schultz had built was being erased, one name at a time. What made the final phase different was its reach. The pressure was no longer confined to Harlem's back streets. The deaths, precise, public, and unmistakable, signaled that hiding inside safe houses or under armed protection would not guarantee survival. Schultz's remaining operators understood something their boss had tried to ignore. This was not about territory anymore. It was about consequences, and consequences followed you wherever you went. Schultz isolated himself, surrounded by guards, issuing frantic orders that produced nothing. His men begged him to pull out. Some simply vanished, choosing flight over loyalty. The countdown notes grew shorter, colder, more final. They no longer needed explanation. Everyone knew why this was happening, and everyone knew how it would end if Schultz refused to accept reality. The last message made the point unmistakable. Harlem was not open for negotiation. It belonged to the people who lived there, understood it, and defended it. The humiliation at the Cotton Club had been answered not with chaos, but with discipline. Not with noise, but with certainty. 8 names had been marked, and the list had been completed. When the killings stopped, the silence was louder than the violence that preceded it. Schultz ordered his remaining operations shut down. His men were pulled out. 18 months of expansion ended in a single week. Harlem was gone. The lesson spread faster than the story itself. Every gangster in New York understood what had happened and why. Power was not just money and guns. It was respect. And disrespect, especially public, deliberate, and racial, carried a price that even the most powerful man could not afford to pay. When the week ended, Harlem returned to its routines, but nothing was the same. Dutch Schultz never announced his retreat publicly. He didn't have to. Everyone knew. His policy banks were gone. His collectors had vanished. His authority in Harlem had been erased so completely that it was as if he had never been there at all. The message had been delivered, received, and understood. Bumpy Johnson reappeared quietly, without celebration or spectacle. There was no victory parade, no public claim of responsibility. That restraint was intentional. The point was never to boast, it was to establish a rule the entire underworld would remember. From that moment on, dealings between white and black gangsters in New York changed. Language changed. Behavior changed. Public disrespect became dangerous, not symbolic. The story spread through speakeasies, social clubs, and back rooms across the city. It was retold not as a legend, but as a warning. Schultz had believed power flowed in one direction downward, enforced by money, violence, and race. Johnson proved something different. Power also flowed from legitimacy, community, and discipline. Harlem protected its own, and anyone who ignored that reality paid the price. 1 month later, Schultz himself was dead, killed by men from his own world who saw him as reckless and unstable. His Harlem defeat was part of that calculation. Johnson, meanwhile, consolidated control and built an empire that lasted decades, not because he was the most violent man in the room, but because he understood when violence should speak and when silence was more effective. The lesson outlived both men. It became an unwritten law of the American underworld. Disrespect invites consequences, and public humiliation invites war. That rule, born from one night at the Cotton Club and 1 week of calculated retaliation, shaped criminal power dynamics for generations. 7 days, 8 men, 1 insult, and a reminder that in the world of power, respect is never optional.